What does it actually take to put a sitting U.S. president on trial? It's a wild question. But back in 1868, the country got incredibly close to finding out, thanks to the explosive story of its 17th president, Andrew Johnson. It's a question that gets right to the heart of American democracy. That whole balance of power thing. A sitting president facing removal from office, being judged by the very same Congress he's supposed to lead. How on earth does a leader end up in that spot? For more than a century, he was the only American president to face that kind of threat. So let's get into it. Let's really unpack the story of how the 17th president of the United States ended up on trial in the first place. And make no mistake, this wasn't just some dry legal proceeding. Nope. This was the explosive final act of a bitter, knockdown, drag-out fight between the president and Congress over the entire future of a nation still reeling from the Civil War. To really get the trial, you've got to understand the man at the center of it all. And Andrew Johnson's journey to the White House was anything but ordinary. We're talking a true climb from the absolute bottom straight to the very top. Johnson's background just set him worlds apart from the political elite. He was born into extreme poverty, never spent a single day in a school, and instead was apprenticed to a tailor. This shaped his whole worldview. He saw himself as a populist, a fighter for the regular person against the wealthy plantation owners. But you could tell he was ambitious, especially after he met and married Eliza McArdle. Get this, while he was working in his tailor shop, she was the one who taught him to read and write proficiently, even helping him with math. His entire education was basically pure determination and his wife's support. And from there, his political rise was just meteoric. He was a fiery, captivating speaker, and he shot up the political ladder with incredible speed. From a local town official to a U.S. senator, winning over voters at every single step. So you might be wondering, how did this Southern Democrat from Tennessee end up as Abraham Lincoln's vice president? It seems a little strange, right? Well, it all comes down to the most unique political crisis in American history, the Civil War. This is where Andrew Johnson gets really complicated. He was a man of contradictions. On one hand, he was a Southerner who owned slaves and believed deeply in states' rights. But he was also a passionate defender of the Union. So when his home state of Tennessee seceded, he made this monumental choice. He became the only senator from a Confederate state to stay loyal to the U.S. Senate. To the North, he was a hero. Back home, he was a traitor. That pro-Union stance made him the perfect running mate for Lincoln in 1864. A symbol of national unity. But just 6 weeks after their inauguration, the absolute unthinkable happened. Lincoln was assassinated. And just like that, Andrew Johnson, the tailor from Tennessee, was suddenly president of a shattered country. And this, right here, is where the trouble really starts. The war was over, but an even harder question was left hanging in the air. How do you possibly put the country back together? This was the era of Reconstruction, and Johnson was now on a direct collision course with Congress. Reconstruction wasn't just about rebuilding cities and bridges. It was about defining the future of America. What would the terms be for the defeated South to come back? And maybe the biggest question of all, what would freedom actually mean for the 4 million people who had been enslaved? Well, the two visions for the country could not have been more different. Johnson, he pushed for a fast, lenient reunion. He offered broad amnesty to former Confederates, but a really powerful group in Congress, called the Radical Republicans, saw this as a complete betrayal. They wanted to fundamentally transform the South and lock in full citizenship and voting rights for newly freed African Americans. Now, Johnson didn't just disagree with Congress. He actively fought them at every turn. He pardoned thousands of Confederates. He stood by as Southern states filled with ex-rebels passed racist black codes to control the freedmen. He vetoed landmark bills meant to protect black citizens. And he even campaigned against the 14th Amendment. The battle lines were officially drawn. This constant conflict between the president and Congress was a total powder keg. And in 1868, it finally exploded, leading to the ultimate constitutional crisis, the trial of a president. So what was the final straw? Well, Congress, kind of seeing this showdown coming, passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act. It basically blocked Johnson from firing cabinet members without their approval. Johnson thought the law was unconstitutional and just openly defied it. He fired his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was a huge critic. To Congress, this was a direct assault on their power. And that set the whole process in motion. The House of Representatives voted to impeach, which is kind of like a formal indictment. But the real drama, the main event, was the trial in the Senate, where the senators would act as the jury. And here's the key. To actually remove Johnson from office, they needed a 2/3 vote. That meant 36 out of 54 senators had to find him guilty. I mean, this trial was the biggest political spectacle the country had ever seen. The tension was just unbelievable. And when the final votes were counted on the most critical charges, the result was stunning. 35 senators voted guilty. 35. Remember, they needed 36. It all came down to one single vote. By the narrowest possible margin, Andrew Johnson was acquitted. He got to serve out the rest of his term as president. The radical Republicans had failed to remove their greatest enemy from office. So Johnson finished his term, but his presidency was effectively broken. So what's his ultimate legacy? How do we remember this president who survived impeachment? Well, Johnson never gave up. You gotta give him that. After leaving the White House, he went back to Tennessee and, in a really remarkable comeback, was elected back to the U.S. Senate in 1875, the very same group that had put him on trial. He's still the only former president to ever do that. He died, though, just a few months into his term. This quote, I think, really captures the tragedy of his story. He was seen as an honest and honorable man, but also one of the most unfortunate presidents. And you can see why. His stubborn fight with Congress and his very lenient policies toward the South are widely seen today as a historic failure, one that really abandoned the promise of Reconstruction and helped pave the way for a century of Jim Crow segregation. And that's really the central question Johnson leaves us with, isn't it? He saw himself as a healer, following what he thought was Lincoln's path of reconciliation. But his actions led to even deeper division and ended up harming the very people the Union had just fought a war to free. It's just a powerful reminder that in history, good intentions are one thing, but consequences, well, they're everything.